So we're going to move on to St. Thomas Aquinas, and again, just give you a little biographical sketch of him. Thomas was born around 1225 AD, so several centuries after Augustine. His father's name was Landulf of Aquino. And Landulf of Aquino was a man of means who was a knight, and I only included this in the biography because I love the name of this king. He was a knight in the service of King Roger II. Now, when I saw that, I started laughing because King Roger II sounds like something out of a Monty Python skit. But there actually was a King Roger II and probably King Roger I then as well. And so Thomas's mother was Theodora. And so Landulf, his father's brother, was an abbot in the Benedictine monastery. And so what was traditional back in that time in Italy, the youngest son was sometimes designated to follow in the footsteps of the uncle and go into the monastery. Well, they wanted him to go into the Benedictine monastery, and Thomas felt called to move into the Dominican priory. And so the Dominican order was fairly new at that time in history, and Theodora, his mom, had a conniption. And so it kind of reminded me of my mom when my brother wanted to get married in the church, and I didn't want to marry him in the church for various reasons. Not that I don't love him. And so my mother told me, "You will marry your brother." And I said, "I will not." I was like a year ordained at that point. And ultimately, I married my brother. And I was actually, in retrospect, I'm happy I did because they had a good marriage for a long time. But anyways, and so she wanted him to be in the Benedictines, and he wanted to be in the Dominicans. And so she resorted at one point to kidnapping him. His brothers came and stole him away for a year or two. And ultimately, cooler heads prevailed, or at least saner heads prevailed. And he was allowed to enter into the Dominican order. And he joined the order between, we don't know for sure, but between 1240 and 1243 AD. In 1251, he began his chief work, the Summa Theologica, which he never completed. And so it took the rest of his life to work on that. The Summa Theologica is basically a catechism for Christians and Catholics. And so he spent his lifetime doing it, and most seminarians are required to study it, if not read it. I had a class on St. Thomas Aquinas in seminary, and I can't remember much of the Summa, a few things. But it is an incredible piece of work, and it's one of the seminal books in the life of the church on theology. And so he began that in 1251. And it's also not surprising to find out that he had frequent experiences of ecstasy. I mean, people recounted how he would actually levitate from his bed. I mean, he had this close union with God that was expressed in these ecstatic unions that to the untrained observer was something that was very incredible. And so he had frequent bouts of these periods of ecstasy in his life. And so that was something that became a part of who he was later on in his life. In May of 1274, Thomas was called to the Second Council of Lyon, where his works of Pope Urban IV would be presented. While journeying to that meeting, now this tells you even the saints don't always have it easy. On his way to that meeting, Thomas hit his head on the branch of a fallen tree and fell ill. He was escorted to recover, but unfortunately he became ill once again, and then he died in 1274 at the age of 49, which was more, even back then that was a little bit older than most men lived. But it's still young, certainly by our standards today. And when you think about all that he contributed to the life of the church, to have done so in that period of his life of 49 years is even more incredible. He was buried in the church in Toulouse, France on January 28th, 1369. And in 1323, Pope John XXII canonized him. So if you're wondering, Pope John XXIII was just made a saint a few years ago from the early 60s. His predecessor, name-wise, was Pope in the 14th century. So there was a long period of time between John XXIII and John XXII. And so originally his feast day was on March 7th, which was the date of his death. But because that date falls during Lent, in 1969, a revision of the Roman calendar changed his feast day to January 28th the dates that his relics were moved to the church in Toulouse. And so Pope Pius V declared St. Thomas a doctor of the church, saying that Thomas was the most brilliant light of the church. And he is the patron saint of something not too exciting, but certainly understandable. He's a patron saint of universities and students. So now there's other saints who have incredible stories of what they're patron saints of. I'll just tell you one, just for fun. St. Nicholas. There's no children here, right? Okay. So St. Nicholas is the patron saint of barrel makers. I found this out last year. The reason why he's a patron saint of barrel makers is because it is told that St. Nicholas raised a child from the dead who had been murdered and placed in a pickle barrel. And so as a result of that, he is now the patron saint of barrel makers. I mean, it's incredible stories like that make the saints so fun. And so now in the day and age that we have Google and other search engines, fortunately, our young people are using it to good advantage, not necessarily just poor advantage or disadvantage. But as pastor of 2 parishes now, usually I'm responsible for the kids who are going through the confirmation prep in terms of their letters to the bishops and the names that they give themselves for confirmation. And we're getting some really unusual saint names for kids. One was Cleopatra. Now I thought, Cleopatra? There's no such saint as Cleopatra, so I challenged the child on that. And of course the child looked up on the internet that Cleopatra was indeed a saint in the Eastern Rite Church. I forget what she was the patron saint of, but so I had to relent and allow her to be named Cleopatra. But these kids will look up, if they want to be a particular occupation when they grow up, they'll look up the patron saint of truck drivers and they'll find out who that saint is. So it's really easy to do. So if you're ever wondering who the patron saint is of something in your life, Google it and then you'll get the saint. But I digress. So I'm going to begin by quoting probably the most prevalent thing that Augustine says in the Summa about beauty. He says, "Beauty and goodness in a thing are identical fundamentally, for they are based upon the same thing, namely the form," hearkening to Augustine, "and consequently goodness is praised as beauty. But they differ logically, for goodness properly relates to the appetite, goodness being what all things desire, and therefore it has the aspect of an end, the appetite of being a kind of movement toward a thing. On the other hand, beauty relates to the cognitive faculty, for beautiful things are those which pleases when seen." And so he's moving towards an experience of beauty being a cognitive or intelligent reality. And so beauty is something that we can discern as human beings, again, similar to Augustine, because we have the intelligence to be able to do so. As I said in the previous section, my dog Molly is not going to be able to discern what is beautiful because she doesn't have the intelligence to do that. She just has the instinct to live and to, I'm sure dogs experience happiness. I mean, she looks very happy when I come home most of the time. And so, not that they don't experience happiness, but their happiness is much different than ours because they don't have a concept of what beauty is, dogs and other creatures. And so he talks about God as the cause of harmony and brightness, beauty in all things. So again, he's going to go back to that definition of brightness, that experience of brightness. And that brightness is goodness. And so when there's a harmony of good things coming together, the more good things come together, the more we are able to experience beauty, and the stronger that experience of beauty is going to be. And so he talks about harmony as being understood in 2 ways. First, according to the order of creatures to God. So remember I talked about with Augustine that you kind of go in that progression from rock to plant to fish to bird to animal to human being to angels to saints to God. And so there's that progression that creates harmony. But he also talks about created things and their ordering towards each other. And so that harmony from one to the other leads to beauty as well. And so he talks about God is the cause of harmony by ordering all things to himself. So God created what God created purposefully. And so there are no accidents with God, accidents in terms of random things. And so there are no accidents with God. God created things the way God created them because God has a plan. And so those things are structured and in harmony and in order. And so because God is beauty itself, God is the object and end to which all creatures are drawn. So he creates us in such a way, creates his creatures in such a way that they are all ultimately ordered to God, even if they lack the intelligence to know that they're doing that.